So in this activity, what we're going to do, we are going to learn how to create a moisture sensor. And we're going to do it with some very simple parts. We're going to need our Grove Shield. We're going to need a microbit. We are going to need a alligator clip with a nail and another alligator clip with a nail. I use red and black ones just because it keeps it easier for me to remember. But it doesn't matter what color that you use. And we're also going to use our little 4-digit screen. And we also have an OLED screen that is available, but for this initial one, we're just going to use the little the little 4-digit display. And we can use the microbit itself as a display, which we will also do as well. And you will also need one cable. Okay. The other things that we're going to need to have at our disposal will be some dirt that we're going to test, and we will also need some water to test whether our sensors are actually working. Okay, so let's get going. First thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new project. I'm going to call this one Nail Moisture because we're using nails. Alright, it starts up. For this one, what I'm going to do, since I want to use our little 4-digit display, I am going to install our Grove extension. So let's install that. So again, that's just going to the extensions, searching for Grove, and you should get a new block that shows up. Now, I'm going to put something in the start menu here just so it will always be there so we don't have to remember to do it in the forever loop. So I'm going to make my coding area here a little bit bigger to make the screen a little bit easier to see. So what I want to do is I am going to go over to my variables. I'm going to create a new variable. I'm going to make this variable called display. And this is the display for my little 4-digit screen. And I'm going to set that display in my start menu. And I am going to plug in my 4-digit display. There it is, my little 4-digit display block, which is in my Grove block. I am going to pop it into my set display. And I'm going to plug my display in the pin P2 and P16. Okay, so let's plug this guy in. And again, your plugs only go in one way, so if it doesn't go in, you just flip it around. Okay, so I'm going to change my 4-digit display to P2 and to P16, which is on my Grove Shield. Okay, now let's go to our forever loop. And what's nice about having that in the on start is that I'll never have to worry about setting this up again. Now, we're going to need another variable because what I want to do is I want to measure the moisture content of this dirt, right? So that's the variable I want to collect data on. So let's call it moisture. Right? We could call it soil moisture, you can call it anything that you want. So when we begin to think about that, I'm going to call it soil moisture. It's always useful to get students to think about what is it that we want to measure. Odds are that is going to be a variable that you're going to need to create. So now I've got my soil moisture variable. I'm going to change my I'm going to set my soil moisture to. Now what am I going to set it to? That's where this comes in a little bit different because we haven't done this before with our microbit. Is just for right now, what we are going to do is we're going to put our red cable, or one cable, I'm going to attach it to the 3.3 volt side of the microbit, and that's going to be attached to our Grove Shield. So now I'm going to take my black one and I'm going to put it down in P0. Okay, so that's right underneath the 3.3 volts on our Grove Shield. Okay, and I'm just going to head and plug in my microbit. Okay, and I'm going to make sure that I've got a nail attached to my alligator clip. And then again, the alligator clip should work fine for this. What's nice about the nail is that then the nail allows you to stick it down in the soil and hold it there. Okay. All right, so I am going to set that soil moisture to a reading, and that is going to be under my pins, because remember these numbers, these P1, P2, P3, that's on your shield and microbit, stand for pins. And we're going to be reading an analog number, so we're going to have to read an analog soil moisture. I'm going to set it to analog read pin P0. That's my black one. Okay, the 3.3 volts is going to insert a current, and that's going to help us drive current in our soil, and so that will help us get a sense of how electrified, let's say, our dirt is per se. Okay. Now, next up is I want to be able to see this data on my display. So I'm going to go to my Grove. I'm going to go to scroll down, show number. So I'm going to show, it defaults to strip, but I'm going to change that to display because I've defined my display to be my little 4-digit display screen. Okay? And I'm going to have it display my soil moisture. Okay. Now, the last thing that I want to do to make sure that I'm getting the readings is I'm going to have it also display on my microbit. So that's going to go to under the basic block, and I'm going to have it show me a number. And to prevent the digits from arriving, you can do a round. So it's good practice just to include round. Otherwise, you're going to do it one time and you're going to get 47.976398, and it's going to keep going on forever. So including the round is not a bad practice to include, unless you want that number of digits, which you rarely will do. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to round what I'm going to try to collect, and I'm trying to collect my data around soil moisture. So this is our very simple program to be able to monitor my soil moisture. Now there's going to be a little trick that we're going to have to worry about here. Since this is an analog system, or an analog sensor, that means it's going to come with a value from 0 to 1023, which means it's not really reading soil moisture. It's reading a voltage difference, and it's converting that into a number. And so that may or may not be exactly what the soil moisture temperature is, or soil moisture is. So what we have to do is we're going to calibrate it. And this is good practice anytime that you're playing around with sensors, to calibrate it, which means we're just going to try to figure out what's the low number for the sensor and what's the high number for the sensor, and then we'll have a sense for when we collect data whether we need to water our plants or not water our plants. Okay. So I've already got a program installed on here. So what we want to do is, what reading am I getting if I just have this stuck in something dry? Okay. And so right now, I don't have it stuck in anything, and it looks like that I am reading at about 346, and that's the same across both of them, which means that I am getting good data. Okay. So that's going to be our low number, right? So we can choose to write that down in a notebook, or we can decide that 346 is low. So we can define that basically to be our 0 point, right? Because I'm in air, right? There's no moisture in theory that's here, right? And you should be able to get some change when you hold it, right? Mine just jumped to 947 when I'm holding it together, right? And you're eventually going to max it out. So what you want to go is, does this really max myself out? Okay. So what you can do is, if you have a glass of water handy, you can stick it in the water, and since this is analog and it goes from 0 to 1023, it should jump to 1023 when you stick it in water, because in theory that's the maximum that you're probably going to get. Okay. All right. So now we have that as a pretty good test. Now let's test it on soil. Okay. So let's give our nails a drying off. Make sure they're nice and dry. And let's get a baseline reading. Okay, so this is fairly dry soil. All right, and if you really wanted to try to test this, is set your soil out in the sun for a couple of days and let it really dry out, and then let's see what our baseline reading is. So I'm going to stick this in, and maybe my soil is not as dry as I thought it was. Looks like I'm getting about 1,020. So this was setting outside, so it's pretty moist. So I don't really have to water anything. So this soil is pretty good to go. All right. So we now get a sense for what's high and what's low. Okay. So one of the things that you can do is to test out your dry soil and your moisture settings is we have our little cubes that, if you haven't used them all, you can stick it in and evaluate what constitutes being dry and what constitutes being damp. Right. So again, looks like my base level is right around 332, which is about right. And now what I am going to do to try to get a sense for how this is going to work with something that's going to start off as dry, I am going to add just a little bit of water to this and decide whether I think that's going to be enough water for my plant or not. Okay, so now we're going to add in some water, and it's going to absorb it. Okay, and we'll let it set here for a bit. Okay, and we'll figure out how much moisture that I really want to add. Okay. Alright, so now as that soaks up the water, it's going to come and eventually give me a reading of what's going to be about right. Right. So that's roughly how we set up our soil moisture sensor. So while my water is soaking up, what I want to do in our next little activity is we're going to use this data to do something with it. Because if you collect the data, great, but we want to do something. So maybe we want to have an alarm go off or something like that.